Okay, I think we will begin. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Gail Mandel, and I am the Deputy Director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I am so pleased that you have joined us today for our program featuring Bruce Guenther and Judy Margles, co-curators of Turning Inward, Judy Chicago, from the collections of Jordan D. Schnitzer and his Family Foundation, who will be discussing the film WOMANHOUSE in the context of Judy Chicago's legacy in the annals of feminist art practice. OJMCHE's mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. Almost all of the museum's virtual programming, including today's event, and recordings of past events are offered without charge, and we'd be grateful for any donation that you might be able to make to support our work. If you wish to support the museum in this way or explore membership, please visit the support page on our website. Currently, the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. In addition to the Judy Chicago exhibition, on view now in the Menashe Gallery is The Prophets, lithographs by Reuven Rubin, which is comprised of 12 works by the Romanian-born Israeli painter. And as always, our three core exhibitions about the Holocaust, discrimination and resistance in Oregon, and the Oregon Jewish experience are available for viewing on the second floor. On July 12th at 7 p.m., we will be offering one additional program in conjunction with the Judy Chicago exhibition. We will be presenting In Conversation, a response to the legacy of Judy Chicago. Join us in person at OJMCHE for a stimulating discussion focused on Chicago's legacy as a pioneering feminist Jewish artist who continues to make politically engaged art to this day. Panelists include artist Sarah Horowitz and Shelley Jordan, and art historian Sarah Diver, each of whom bring a uniquely political and cultural perspective to the conversation. Tickets can be purchased on our website. Finally, I would like to invite you all to join us for the museum's annual meeting to learn more about OJMCHE's future from Board Chair Jeff Mazur and Director Judy Margles. We will also acknowledge board members cycling on and off the board. The meeting will be held on Tuesday, June 21st, that's next week, from 4:30 to 6 p.m. in person at OJMCHE. A live stream option will also be available. There is no cost to attend, and please RSVP on our website. And now for today's program. It is my pleasure to welcome Bruce Guenther, OJMCHE's Adjunct Curator for Special Exhibitions, and Museum Director Judy Margles. Please enter any questions that you have for them during the discussion in the chat. And now I will turn things over to Judy.
Gail, thanks so much. And I want to give everyone a warm welcome for joining us today. I hope you've all had a chance to watch the film WOMANHOUSE. As I said at the beginning of the program, if you feel like putting in the chat your impressions of it, I see a few people have chimed in, and you know, I think we're going to get into our reactions to the film a little bit. I certainly had a number of conflicting emotions as I was watching. I'm really just so grateful that Bruce Guenther is with us today. I think he's really going to help us understand the importance of WOMANHOUSE in the context of Judy Chicago, her contribution to feminist art and art in general. Our format today is going to be very straightforward. I'm just going to take a few minutes and frame the conversation with a brief introduction, and then bring Bruce into the conversation to provide his always brilliant curatorial lens. No pressure, Bruce. Women play an integral role in the arts. They've been painters, writers, sculptors, curators, critics, and more. Yet if we think about it, only a small number of women over the last centuries have found their way to great success. Most have been largely forgotten about or not credited for their work. Well, maybe we can say that is until Judy Chicago. She arrived on the scene just as the feminist art movement in California was taking off. This was 1970. It was a year that saw women protesting the art and technology exhibition at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And in that show, not one woman artist was included. But it was also in 1970 that Judy Chicago established the feminist art program at California State University in Fresno. The feminist art program, the first in the country, offered courses in female art history taught by women for women only. A year later, she moved the Fresno program to the California Institute of the Arts. It was here that Judy Chicago realized that the first step in creating an audience for feminist art was to find a way for people to see it. Caltech was still under construction, right? I think you saw this at the beginning of the film. But what happened is students of the feminist art program, they launched this large-scale site-based collaborative project, WOMANHOUSE, spearheaded by Chicago, and her colleague, Canadian-born Miriam Shapiro, an artist 16 years older than Chicago. And Chicago, of course, saw her as her mentor. And I'm sure if you have read anything about Judy Chicago, you see the prominence that Miriam Shapiro played in the early part of her career. So they worked together over the course of 2.5 months with students and 3 other LA artists. And together they transformed this a Hollywood mansion. You saw it at the beginning of the film. It had been slated for demolition, and they transformed it into an art environment that eloquently protested the domestic servitude of women's life. Every space was created by a different artist or a group of artists, all related to the topic of women and domesticity. The young women, they literally rolled up their sleeves to replace broken windows, engage in electrical work, refinish floors, and other hard labor. On January 30th, 1972, WOMANHOUSE opened to the public, but on the first day, they only allowed female visitors to attend. Altogether, there were about 10,000 people who came to see the installation in the months that followed. Time magazine wrote an article, called it Bad Dream House. There was an article in the LA Times that described it as a lair of female creativity. And for many visitors, it was the first time they'd ever seen feminist art. You can see that, and we'll talk about that a little later, but of course you could see in the film the sheer discomfort of many men who went in to see the installation. As you saw in the film, there were 21 feminist installations. We saw the menstruation bathroom by Judy Chicago herself, bridal staircase, nightmare bathroom, eggs to breast. One of the installations, the linen closet by Sandy Orgel, it featured a mannequin built into a linen closet. You saw her stepping with one foot out towards the viewer. Every detail of this house was curated, portraying, in the words of the film's narrator, right at the beginning, you heard her say that she was portraying the daydreams women have as they wash, bake, cook, sew, clean, and iron their lives away. Not sure that those would be my daydreams, but the daydreams from the installation, but we can talk about that. Chicago and Shapiro viewed WOMANHOUSE as a way to embolden young artists and provide an opportunity for them to move to a new level of artwork. They talked about the way that female art students approached art making and how it was often conditioned by the boxes they were put into and grew up with, such as unfamiliarity with art processes or the resistance against pushing themselves beyond their limits. Judy Chicago noted, quote, "People who don't go to art galleries feel comfortable about coming to a house, and a lot of them went away very moved." So I'm just really, really glad that Bruce Guenther is with us today to help us understand more about Judy Chicago and the significance of WOMANHOUSE and other of Chicago's works. I often feel Bruce needs no introduction, but let me say a few words about him. As Gail pointed out, Bruce serves right now as the adjunct curator of special exhibitions here at the museum. He created this show, The Turning Inward, Judy Chicago. He's the former chief curator and Robert and Mercedes Eichholz curator of modern and contemporary art at the Portland Art Museum, where he served between 2000 and 2014. He's written extensively on the art of the last 100 years, a popular lecturer on contemporary art. Bruce is a frequent curator for regional and national exhibitions. Here at OJM, we've been so fortunate for many of the exhibitions that we've presented since being in this building that Bruce has curated. These include our inaugural exhibition 5 years ago, Alphabet, the Alphabet of Memory, featuring the work of Grisha Bruskin, I Am This, art by Oregon Jewish artists, and R.B. Kittai, a Jew, etc., etc. So Bruce, welcome. Are you there?
Yes.
See you? Yeah, wonderful.
Good to see you, Judy.
So I'm going to pull the old Rachel Maddow trick and just ask the question. I love it when she asks. From my intro, anything you want to add or amplify from what I opened up with?
Well, I think I would add that the Woman House is an artifact of its age, of the moment in which it happened, which is not to demean it in any way, except many of the issues have evolved that the house deals with. And to experience this vision of some 20 women of different generations now is to be pulled back in time to a place that changed the way we live today in real terms. And because Woman House is credited with being the first female-centered installation in the world and has gone on to be replicated across the world in countries as diverse as Thailand, Japan, across Europe, into South America. And it remains a viable form in cultures in which the patriarchy has its icy grip on women's lives.
Yeah, no, thank you. And, we should point out, I appreciated that you kind of mentioned all the woman houses happening across the world, or that have happened across the world. And it is, of course, we mentioned the installation happened in 1972, and that does make it the 50th anniversary of Woman House. And we'll talk a little bit later about the Woman House project that Judy Chicago is currently involved in. So Bruce, clearly, without dating you, I will date you. You are old enough to remember when Woman House was created. So what are your memories of your first encounter with Judy Chicago?
Well, I would probably echo Gloria Steinem, who said famously, "I can divide my life between before and after meeting Judy Chicago." And I, in my personal history, was an art student in the 60s, coming out of school in 1970 on the West Coast. I had seen Judy Chicago's work in exhibitions in Southern California as we would hitchhike down the coast from Oregon to San Francisco and LA to go to art museums and galleries. And it was seminal for me when Woman House came out, because I was involved in my first serious relationship with a woman for 7 years. We were trying to build, it sounds like the present day, a co-equal partnership in life that valued no one's experience over the other person's. That was in the result of a series of conscious raising experiences. It was very much the moment. Didn't own a car because the industrial military complex. We rode bicycles, and we were vegans. And it was the moment when this work hit the national news, and we tried to find a way to get down to see it. We didn't succeed, but we did see the dinner party later, and it changed the way literally changed the way I saw art, my art practice, and what, as a curator, I came to value in the art that I would put on view. Woman House, for me, was the equivalent of Stonewall in 1969 and the bridge at Selma. Seminal moments in the evolution of the American dream and the American consciousness. Moments when the fulcrum tips and another reality becomes possible.
Can I just interject? Do you recall whether it was as important as, just brilliant in the 2.5 months it was shown, I think it was actually shown in the month that it was shown, or was it more the reaction afterwards and the writing about it?
When 10,000 people saw it in LA, it rippled right back into the art schools. I had 2 friends who were in Cal Arts when it happened. Both of them were men, or boys, more likely, and their world changed in the interaction with the female students they were going to school with, because the women demanded something else. There were confrontations in the classroom. There were questions about formalism. But it is, you're right, the subsequent ripple out from it. Women came from all over the country to see it, particularly women, the feminists from New York, women I knew in Chicago who went to LA to see it, because there were a series of seminars, conferences, symposia on the emerging feminist political, social, and aesthetics. You know, Betty Friedan's book was 1963, The Feminine Mystique, and there had been a decade, almost a decade's worth of writing and discussion and consciousness raising about what the roles and the life of a woman was about, and how to reclaim or claim for the first time, against the weight of history, the right to self-determination, to control one's body.
Can we look back a little bit and try and help us understand? I think if anybody, caught what I said, I was in my intro, I think for the sake of words, I said, women's art was largely neglected until Judy Chicago. That was entirely hyperbolic, of course. But I think
that was actually accurate.
You think it was accurate? Well,
for example, Miriam Shapiro made very interesting abstract expressionist work, unable to get a gallery or get noticed in New York, like Elaine de Kooning, Joan Mitchell, all of them central to the dialogue about making work that was based in gesture and the passion of color and its implicit poetic and emotional content. And yet there was no recognition of those women in the 60s, the 50s, starting in the mid-40s, 50s and 60s. Women were participants, often important in the theoretical dialogue of the times, but without credit. What Judy Chicago introduced, by elbowing her way into the middle of the LA art scene and then changing the pedagogical basis for teaching art, was that art had content. Art had to have a content that came from the core of the artist, through all the filters of society, history, and emotion. And I think that was the change between the art before WOMANHOUSE and the dinner party and afterwards. It is the validation of content, and content that had a gender and an emotionality that was not present in the formalist constructs of even regional painting, regional painting.
So can we dig, and Bruce, I just want the audience to know, Bruce actually can't see us. So if it looks like I'm interrupting him, he's good, right, Bruce?
Oh yeah, it's like any conversation we have.
Right.
We interrupt each other.
Right, exactly. So, but just, when you think about the feminism that, there was a wave of feminism that, began in whether you can say the late 1900s, early 20th century. By the 1920s, women's liberation may not have had those words, but it was certainly a thing. We had the 19th Amendment. Women, most women in the United States, many women in the United States were given the right to vote. Oregon, it was 1912. So things were happening. Women were gaining power in other areas. They were understanding they had a right to a career. Even the issues of sexual freedom were talked about before 1970 in some way. And if you think about the war, you've got men going into the service, so women went into the workforce. We know all that. I'll just say in 1943, Peggy Guggenheim, there was an exhibition in New York that she launched. It was an exhibition of 31 women, right? So things were happening, but
and there were 1,000 other exhibits that included no women. Judy,
right.
The point is not
Right.
that there wasn't incremental change going on with 51% of the population, and their empowerment slowly, battle after battle after battle. But when women got the vote, their husband would instruct them on who to vote for.
Can you speak to
there are theater
right.
pieces about it that are comedies of the era, and the overbearing husband and the silent wife I still see happening today when the last president was elected. So what happened, I think, in the teaching of art, which is where Judy Chicago made her first radical kind of move, is she challenged the academic bureaucracy and the pedagogical model, which valued system, method, and material manipulation over content. That abstraction without meaning was the penultimate form. And so in 1970, we had moved through abstract expressionism. The art world was involved with pop art, or more likely, minimalism and the evolving conceptual and land art movements. Those were dominated by men. Although there were important women practitioners, they were not being written into the history. They were not participating in the survey exhibitions. That Judy Chicago, as a young woman just out of college, was included in the primary structure show in 1966 in New York, which I saw as a graduation gift trip to New York as a child, as a senior in high school. That she was included in that as one of the few women in that show. Jo Baer, Judy Chicago. It was a miracle. Interestingly enough, it was a gay Black curator, Keniston McShine, who at the Jewish Museum in New York put that show together, and it changed the valuing of primary structures of minimalism. But it didn't change the world.
Right.
Whereas the 10,000 people who saw the WOMANHOUSE were engineers, mothers, grandmothers, daughters. They came from life to this spectacle, and they left having recognized some part of their life was on view. They left with, if they sat through the performances, being validated emotionally.
Yeah. And you could really, I think one of the wonderful gifts of the film were the opportunity to watch the observers, right? People who went into the house. And that's a good segue, because I want to talk about men, right? I mean, there were the discomfort of men was so intentional on the part of the filmmaker, right? To make sure that people understood what it was like to be a man and walk in there and then have a mic put in your face and have to talk about it. John Baldessari, this, unfortunately, it wasn't in the film. I think it would have been great. Infamously, I don't know whether he was the most famous visitor to go into WOMANHOUSE, but he had cowboy boots on, and he is an artist, in case people don't recognize the name. And there was a sculpture of a woman with her legs spread, and he was wearing cowboy boots, and he stuck his boot in the crotch of this sculpture, and people were. I don't know, Bruce, if you know more about the reaction of the crowd, but really, and you can talk about that, but I think my more serious question for you is, as a man, what has it been like for you to get to know intimately and become a scholar of Judy Chicago and her work.
Liberating.
Interesting. Say more.
It was, it broke down the wall between male and female in critical ways. In its exposure of the emotional pain or celebration of women's lives and experiences. As a man, you may never have thought of birthing in the way that you did after experiencing the performance, the push performance, which is incredibly simple, but so moving. You know, I was a Vista volunteer and in 1970, and had a 13-year-old child breach in the back of my car as we raced to the hospital with her. And it was, there was something so powerful about that, seeing that performance again, having seen it when the film came out, because it was shown in women's centers all over the country, at colleges, and even high school art department. A friend of mine was teaching at, she showed it. Principal didn't like it, but the students loved it. But to see that again is to relive something that's sort of this critical moment in life, and the way that the women moved together, and the kind of coming out, and then the holding, and the way the rhythm of the holding, and the kind of security that triad that was formed of the performers. A sacred geometry. This is something that Judy Chicago uses throughout her work, is a sense of the power of the triangle as a form, just as the circle in its completeness is a powerful symbol. And I for me, that was important. And to watch the film is to see how because it's a series of, on one level, it's a series of stereotypes. It's a series of predictable things at this point in time, looking back. But the men, the three men who couldn't find the words to deal with menstruation and the menstruation bathroom, and the kind of semi-comic thing. The single older man who looks at a dollhouse, and the dollhouse is full of the kind of dreams and nightmares, some of them very Hollywood-like, some of them very kind of literary and out of fiction, but real spiders, snakes, shores, and he gives the kind of classic Hollywood grimace and walks away. To the young men, often sitting with their girlfriends, their partners in some level, whose faces are neutral, but their eyes are questing. I mean, to go through that, I think changes you. It changed me. Cynthia and I were going through so many of those things as in role-playing sessions and cabin dancing in the woods, and consciousness raising, and all of the things in women's groups, and then men's groups that I was involved with in running, to try and identify, to validate, to explore the emotional realities of being female, of being male, of trying to make a relationship in the 70s that was honest and equal. And so for the men portrayed in the film, you see all of them. The beautiful thing of that man holding that child as the child needs to move and dance, and he expressed what many of us with long hair and overalls and Cambry shirts were feeling and experiencing. And Woman House gave us ammunition. It gave us a challenge. It pushed us into someplace else.
It might be interesting for our listeners to hear a little bit about the relationship between Miriam Schapiro and Judy Chicago. And
it's a very interesting one.
If you want to say a little bit about that, and maybe in the context of, Judy Chicago is a polarizing figure in the art world. I don't think that we can dispute that. So maybe by way of talking a little bit about their relationship and even her relationship with her students and sort of some of the sort of the noise around womanhood about her supremacy, I guess, in wanting to be the front figure for Woman House. But anything it's a double-barreled question. Sorry, let me just put the other part of the question in there, if I might, Bruce, or I can come back to it. The reception to her work has been polarized, and I'd love to have you comment about why this reception why she has received these polarizing comments over the years.
Well, yeah, okay. We'll start with Miriam
lots of questions.
Schapiro and Judy Chicago. You mentioned their age difference. Miriam is almost a generation older than Judy. And so there is the mentor-mother psychological construct. But there was also, Miriam Schapiro helped empower Judy Chicago. She was doing this radical women's program in Fresno. And Miriam, who was married to Paul Brock, who was appointed the dean of the California Institute of the Arts, CalArts in Valencia, the Walt Disney funded radical new art school. And Miriam had met Judy because of their interest in feminism and their interest in finding stronger, better places for women to work and to be seen and to find space in the sun. Miriam, of course, had to do this because her husband was a notorious chauvinist. Cigar clenched in his teeth, Paul Brock was a piece of work. That's a personal comment. So Judy had sought her out and they shared a dialogue. Judy's observations were Miriam was older and more formalist and empowered because of her relationship with a man. Judy was out of art school, elbowing her way into the art scene, literally, physically, forcing her way into the boys' club. Miriam came as a guest lecturer to Fresno. She was impressed by it. She pulled some faculty members and Paul Brock up to Fresno to witness this feminist program, to make the decision to bring it to CalArts and move it there. And so they offered Judy a 2-year contract. And Miriam, as the facilitator, the mentor figure, and Judy were made co-directors of the program. And therefore, they were set up to empower each other, to challenge each other. And no conversation goes unchallenged with Judy Chicago. Her methodology is about inquiry, confrontation, and exploration. And she will move, but it is always about finding and challenging assumptions. Her own artist practice, as she outlined in Through the Flower, her first book, was both instrumental in the way I was thinking about making art and how I looked to artists' process to see what they were doing. But it also challenged Miriam's assumptions about formalism, about how art was made. So the two of them find themselves in conflict. And they ended up dividing the program at CalArts into studio-based workers, artists, young women who thought they were learning to be artists by doing the classical agenda, the classical pedagogy of drawing, color, theory, form, painting. And those women who Judy brought 8 or 9 students with her from Fresno to CalArts, got them on scholarships, got them into the school so they could continue working with her. And they were interested in this collaborative, collective process of role-playing, professional practice, and building their sense of self. A sense of self that was combative and physical in a way that traditional art training is not for women. And it confronted Miriam Schapiro in her assumptions and her security of her empowered position as the wife of the dean and the co-chair of this program. It was fraught with things, each of them wanting to find a better place, Chicago and Schapiro, to stand as women artists in the world of art, and the different paths they would choose. I think that's the best way to characterize it.
And the reception to Judy Chicago's work, I guess it really is a different question, but
it is a different question, because I think there you have to look at what she moves from pure abstraction to intensely personal figuration over the course of her 60-year career. And in each successive step, she makes different changes in the methodology and the materiality of the art she produces. She begins as a formalist, she spray paints, she uses industrial materials and technological innovation to make some of the most elusive and evocative minimalist works in the California Light and Space School. It's incredibly beautiful work and tinged with a sense of emotion and meaning. But she moves then to the dinner party after WOMANHOUSE, which is performative and installation oriented, that uses found objects and created objects, like the collages in the drawers of the kitchen, the nurture kitchen, in which scrapbooking becomes dreamscapes in the bottoms of the drawers, these free association collages that we see today now as people use TikTok and Pinterest to make up panels of things that touch them and they want to think about or use or emotionally use. But anyway, so there's this thing. Judy moves to the point where she, in the dinner party, appropriates traditional women's crafts, needlework, lace making, quilting, drawing, ceramics, china painting. She uses those to make a heroic work. Again, one of the, I think probably the marker artwork of the 20th century.
the dinner party.
The dinner party.
Interesting.
But it comes out of her experience in the house, where all of these ideas about domestic duties, domestic realities, the female body and its functions, the performances, all of them contribute to her growing sense of what the female history of art and its retrieval that she had been doing from Fresno. Because part of what Judy does are these lectures about women artists and what their work's about, it, interpreting them from a window of women's issues and women's ideas that are validated by the core, by the body and the heart.
Bruce, it's a trite phrase, but we know the reception to the dinner party and to WOMANHOUSE and to a lot of Judy Chicago's work has been not necessarily positive. Do you think the dinner party was ahead of its time? That's my trite phrase.
No, it seemed to be right at the moment, because there was an entire movement going on in the craft field to validate the art credibility of ceramics and textiles and metalworking. And she comes in by way of empowering women's traditional forms of creative expression, which were not in the pantheon of sculpture and painting. And at the same time that in the craft community, the battle was on to validate ceramics. Peter Volkus, John Mason were doing that, and textiles, Lenore Tawney, a prime example of a textile artist who was trying to make the validity of sculptural ceramics and textiles valid as an art form and equal to painting and bronze sculpture. And so the dinner party happens at this nexus of activities, political. You know, it's the reason I referenced the Bridget Selma, Stonewall, and Woman House. All of them confrontations by disempowered and marginalized communities.
But why weren't audiences or art critics, art historians more receptive? Like,
yeah, that's easy. The art critics with the most powerful seats as tastemakers and gatekeepers were all male in 1970.
Bingo. Yeah.
And their reaction were classically outraged. This is crap. And you know what's happened is then she, you know, they talk about, you know, vulva politics and, you know, demeaning things said in classic ways about the work and about the collective power of 400 individuals who come together in artistic, artisanal, and managerial support to realize this vision that comes out of the drawings that Judy Chicago started making after WOMANHOUSE, and that led to the intellectual, emotional, and artistic exploration of celebrating the idea of celebrating 1,000 women who have changed history, who are part of history but unacknowledged.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the critical response is there. There is also then the conflict within the feminist movement, in which, you know, it's very interesting. It's this notion about what is this valid subject of art? Well, you know, there is a whole kind of conflict, and it happens in a conference, and Judy gets attacked by women who say, you know, biology is not destiny. My work is brain over body, mind over soul. And Judy Chicago says, no, it's brain and body. It's mind and soul together.
Yeah.
But it's the form she uses. And, you know, the form, she develops a kind of a pictorial style and a way of representing the body that is accessible, because much of her career has been about empowering women to be equal partners, to understand that the role and craft of being an artist is physical work, and it's doing. It's not sweet and tender and fragile. In the beginning, you have to be able to make work that commands attention and an audience. And then you have her personality. She is an aggressive, ambitious, and determined. That's never really gone down very well in a show.
And woman, and you forgot to say she's a woman with this personality.
Yes, yes. Well, because, you know, she is a woman.
Yeah.
And, you know, as a heterosexual woman, she is not afraid to talk about what she wants, how she wants it, and when, in any aspect of her life. And some of the criticism is because she talks about the physical sexual response of a woman to the world. People are uncomfortable with that. I mean, we see it every day in this culture. You know, and she came to power. She came to prominence. There was no power to be had at that point. at a time when we were redefining male and female. It was very important. And I see today these reveal parties that suddenly become explosions of pink or blue. And Cynthia and I, when our friends were starting to have children, never gave a gift that wasn't green, no matter what they thought the child was going to be. Because we thought green was probably the color between.
Right.
And we were not going to gender stereotype any child we met.
And I want to, there's a couple of questions in the chat, and one is more specifically related to your last comment. But before we get to that, let's just look at, time is going so quickly. We're not going to get to nearly many of the questions, but let's just look at her legacy for a little bit. We have a little clip. It's just about 30 seconds. Amber, if you can play the clip, it's Judy Chicago talking about what she thinks is the legacy of WOMANHOUSE.
Arts, and we started the first independent feminist art program called the Feminist Studio Workshop, which then led to the Women's Building, which lasted for 20 years and trained hundreds and hundreds of young feminist artists. And the legacy of WOMANHOUSE continues even today. First of all, it opened the way for new subject matter, new techniques, new ideas, a new way of looking at art. It opened the way for that, for generations, and it's still being felt. There are WOMANHOUSES.
Thanks, Amber. That's great. I didn't, everyone, if you hadn't ever seen what Judy Chicago looked like, we wanted also to show the clip that so you could be able to see it. So Bruce, really two questions here about her legacy, right? I mean, do you believe that WOMANHOUSE is directly responsible for part of the freedoms that female artists now enjoy? And then the second question to that is, were any of the issues solved?
Yes, I think clearly what happened, WOMANHOUSE was the first, in a sense, the first time on the West Coast, certainly, that performance art had a content that was female, that was raw and emotional and highly theatrical and staged, but at the time it happened in a way for a broad audience to experience, and it was revelation. The Chicago's insistence on the primacy and materiality of making art that comes from the core of the artist's being, intellectually and emotionally, changed the way object making and performance art happened after 1970. 1974, in that zone. And when the dinner party came, the plethora of crocheted wood and steel sculpture that happened, the kind of ceramic art that began to be validated as these objects morphed in a surreal way into body parts, into couplings. I mean, it all comes back to Judy. And I think, and the artists around her, because many of the women who constructed WOMANHOUSE went on to be teachers, art historians, and artists in the communities that they went back to, that they migrated to. This voice of empowerment and realization, self-realization that came out of the feminist movement, we're now seeing in communities across the country. As artists of color take up the banner of self-realization, of the validity of their feelings and their experiences, bringing forth their histories that have been hidden and buried, unacknowledged. This is the same battle, and it is using tools that were, and imagery and ideas that were generated through WOMANHOUSE and the dinner party. You know, the whole kind of re-sieving history with a different size screen so that you bring up the lost pebbles, the bits of gold or diamonds that are in the bottom of the stream that the main rush of the water has ignored or buried. As a metaphor, it is the importance of inclusiveness and a pedagogy that allows and encourages.
Do you think history will be more kind to Judy Chicago in the next 50 years than it was in the first 50 years?
Will society change enough to accept it? I think she is being celebrated now. She won celebrated at the National Museum of Women Art just 2 months ago with a major gift and prize and a celebration. Her contribution is undeniable. If you look at art history survey books, we always bring up poor old Jansen, and it was the standard text for art history survey courses and the beginnings of any art historian's life. There was not one woman in that book in 1972. And in 1976, the dinner party and Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro are there. And it's the only object by women that you can count on. There's the, yes, now after that breakthrough in the mid 70s, we'll see a Frida Kahlo, a Judy, a Georgia O'Keeffe, a Helen Frankenthaler, maybe a Joan Mitchell, possibly a Jenny Holzer.
You threw Joan Mitchell in for me. Thank you.
Well, and for me, these are all, they're such important voices.
Yeah.
But they were not there then.
Right.
And
Right.
no one even missed them except for that 51%.
There's a question. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to try and push together. And you and I talked about this a little bit last week when we were talking about this program. And I think one of the comments in here is simply the comment, Woman House and the dinner party were not inclusive. And, we talked about Judy Chicago and her apparent heterosexuality, right? It's so vivid, at least it is to me, in her work. So how does her issues of sexuality, do you want to just comment a little bit on how you see sexuality through her work? And do you agree with the statement that someone suggested that neither work were inclusive?
This is retrofitting, but there were lesbians and trans persons and men in the 400 people who made the dinner party. Judy Chicago herself has been had a fluid identity, although primarily and happily a heterosexual woman. There aren't, and Judy Chicago recognizes that the dinner party is an artifact of its age. In 1974, beyond Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence, I don't think you could find an art historian who was not of color who could name another African American or Black American artist.
Wow.
It's the other leg on my table of identity is The Fire Next Time and James Baldwin. And it's rare. Yes. It turns out the Constitution wasn't as inclusive as they thought they were writing, and we thought it meant. We're garbling there, and I'm going to get into the muck. But I think its power is not diminished by the fact, by that fact. The power changed the direction of art. It changed the materials of art. it validated idioms and mediums that were traditionally female, domestic arts. And that was the phrase used, to damn it and to celebrate it. And it contributed to inclusion.
And I guess we might ask too, and it is a question coming in here, we might ask about how motherhood plays into this. I don't actually know whether it was a conscious decision on Judy Chicago's part not to have children. Someone in the chat quoted that she said, there was no way on this earth I could have had children in the career I've had. So
that's true, but she at 3 points considered having children with the men she was involved with. And the last time when she left Lloyd Hammerald and had found a younger man who was interested was the last time it was probably chronologically coming up on a thing, and made a decision that not to have a child. It was a conscious decision. She chose to continue making art, which was the core of her existence, the voice that she had developed. And, but at the same time, she then goes on to make the birthing project, because the birthing performances in WOMANHOUSE and the power of the experience of bringing another generation to life is central to many women's lives. And so she created a whole birthing project that incorporated hundreds of women and literally hundreds of locations where exhibits were staged and women came together and men and women came together in the 80s to talk about the birth experience and, the myths of creation and forward from all cultures. So it's her choice not to have a child made perfect sense. Every ounce of her energy was going into making art, empowering women, and becoming famous. It's like,
without becoming a mother. I mean, I think
there's
something.
You don't have to be a mother to get a driver's license,
right,
or to vote.
Right.
You don't have to be a father, I would point out also, because now, the roles of who stays home with the children has reversed among, middle-class white people mostly.
We're coming up to the hour. But we're going to go maybe a few more minutes for anybody who has to pop off at 1 o'clock. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to come and see the show. It's actually just a jewel, 35 works. And as Bruce was, talking about Judy Chicago's reactions to, formalism, minimalism, all you can sort of chart because the show is laid out chronologically. You can really chart the trajectory of her own vision. So do come and see the show. There is a question that I think we're going to get in more when we do the program in mid-July, but someone really is, I think it's an important question about I was really struck, I think, when I watched WOMANHOUSE, that there was absolutely, Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago, both Jewish artists, but there was nothing, hitting you in the face that was Jewish about WOMANHOUSE. You and I have talked about, ritual purity and those sorts of things. I don't know whether I'm putting you on the spot, if there's anything else about her Jewish heritage that fomented what we saw in WOMANHOUSE.
That's an interesting question, because it's clear both from her biographies and Gail Levin's biography, the intersection of her family's background, her experiences in her home life, and the ongoing engagement with her life, that the ritual acts of the mikveh, of Tumah and Nida around menstruation, about the role and importance of women as and their physicality, all of those things that come out of Judaism that she references. But the house was created by a collection of women who were encouraged to push beyond their limitations, beyond the blinders that they brought to the experience. And they were Jewish and Gentile, women of different classes. I think there are some class biases in the Woman House that are exposed. Many people in America don't have a linen closet or a wedding dress with a 20-foot train.
Good point.
You know, so that there are lots of things in there that as you look back, as we look into it, the assumptions, the well turned out bourgeois kitchen with every utensil, all of it pink, all of the things that kind of shape the consciousness are there. I think underlying it is her own, like the performances about the birthing, about waiting, about the house as the container for women, Orthodox women who find their lives constrained and constricted by their kind of role as the anchor for the family.
Her father, Judy Chicago's father, was, the first of his family to break away from orthodoxy. Judy Chicago grew up in a secular home, even though her father descended from generations of rabbis. So you might think that, I think that also played a large part in her ability to break free, to push boundaries, to question, because she had role models. Her mother too. Her mother really embraced secular left-leaning causes. And, so they were both in their ways trailblazers. And so she, I think she grew up in an environment where she knew she had to make a statement. She had to push. So I think there's something, I think that part of her Jewish upbringing can be felt there too.
Yes.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And though estranged from her mother on one level, her mother was a continuous supporter and volunteer
Absolutely.
in her projects. Yep. And it's this, it's Judy Chicago has lived her life in a very public way, in her diaries, in the 3 autobiographies, in her work. And she exposes herself and she changes. And, she validates the journey and has spent her life saying, art can be an important voice for your journey, but you need to know where you are standing as a woman artist, as an artist in the world, and then reach out and step out from there as honestly and directly as you can. And that will be her legacy. It's that pedagogical commitment to empowerment and the individualization of content in art.
I wish we could end there, but only because I did allude to woman houses across the world in the 50th anniversary. And we know there is a sort of a new installation of Woman House. Judy Chicago is working with artists. I did read, much to my disappointment, for those of us who know Jill Soloway, the producer, the director who created the TV show Transparent. Apparently, she was going to do a series on Woman House, Judy Chicago's Woman House. It did get canceled in 2017, but maybe we should write letters and get that back on. But thinking about new work that's going to come out of this new thinking about Woman House, what are your expectations? What might you imagine you would see?
Well, we're living in an age in which genderization of everything has happened really strongly, and artificial intelligence, as we all create avatars to live somewhere else in meta, and men become women, women become animals or men. And I mean, we're all sort of playing in a field that is still fraught with chauvinist and sexist assumptions. And I think we will see new material manifestations of timeless problems, dilemmas, and oppression. And it will be very inclusive. The lists of artists are very inclusive. They're very broad, and they will invite perspectives that the first Woman House, in trying to be a universal statement about women, missed the ethnic and racial nuances of differentiation. I hope to see a film come out of it that will let us experience it in the same way that Woman House, in its raw, aggressive moment of from the music to the footage that's shot and the assumptions that are made by the camera woman, that we'll see the same thing happen now in a digital, iPhone immediacy.
Well, we're inviting you back if that happens to have another conversation. Bruce, thanks so much. Everyone, Amber, thank you for handling the text so perfectly. Gail, for the eloquent introduction. Bruce, huge thanks to you. Everybody listening in, so glad you came. Sorry we didn't get to everything, but another time. But do come. I just want to say, those of you who saw Woman House and put your comments in the chat will be able to save the chat. So thank you so much for commenting, and please do come and see the show. It's up till September 23rd. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for joining. Hey, Bruce, thank you.
A pleasure.
Okay.
And remember, we're giving tours of the exhibition, you and I.
Oh, we're giving tours. Thank you. Do you know the dates? Anybody know the dates out there? We are.
The
it's on
first
our
one
website.
is the 23rd. It's on our website.
Bruce and I are
doing
right. Bruce and I
tours.
are swapping days. It's all on our website. Yes. So if you want, it's free with admission, free for members, 1 p.m. on dates that neither Bruce starts the 23rd. But do sign up for a tour if you want a personal tour, a guided tour of the exhibition with one of us. Thanks for joining. Take care, everyone.